To another study with After's Heart Ministries. I'm Rabbi Q, and my question for you today is, what is the gospel of Moses? What is the gospel of Abraham? What was the gospel of the kingdom? And what effect does that have upon our understanding of the gospel today? That and more as we get into this week's parasha, which is going to be Yitro. Yitro is actually an interesting one because it is when the Israelites go from the wilderness to Mount Sinai, and Moses' father-in-law shows up and begins to give him some advice about leadership. And then they arrive at Sinai, they receive the Ten Commandments, they get the information that they are going to be in covenant with Yahweh. And so we need to basically jump into Yitro. So first of all, I think one of the things that we probably need to do is we need to work on establishing kind of a boundary concerning what the gospel is and what the gospel isn't, and some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. So let's start with this. Christianity at large is stuck in this concrete system of beliefs in such a way that basically number one is depending on what kind of Christian you are, you believe that you need to save people, right? And furthermore, you believe that people who you bear witness to or who you evangelize to, they need to be given the gospel. And furthermore, you believe that the reason why they need it is because somehow, some way you've established through your creed, which consequently isn't your creed, but we'll get into that they're not yet acknowledged or have confessed what needs to be confessed in order for them to not go to hell. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, the mistakes that have been made concerning this are huge, okay? But one of the things that I want to frame early on in this is that Yeshua did not operate within the confines of creed that we supposedly received from Paul, that now is the standard by which we decide whether or not somebody's saved and therefore need to be given the gospel. Let me tell you one of the things the gospel is not, okay? It is not something that determines whether or not a person is in right standing with God, which has nothing to do with righteousness, by the way. But the premise is that it has nothing to do with their piety or their ability to impress or not impress God, which probably shouldn't be a mentality anyways. But let's say that we just go with the context of the the Torah being a mechanism of information and truth lost to Christianity. Okay, so let's get into this. First thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and jump into the etymological dictionary. Okay, that's going to be important. And very specifically, what I want to jump into is the word gospel. Okay, so let me just go ahead and I will share my screen here. And I'm just going to take that word gospel, which we've looked up a number of times, but let's just get it out there on Front Street. So first of all, Old English God spell, glad tidings announced by Jesus, one of the four gospels, literally good spell. From God, as in good, see good, and then spell, story or message. See spell. A translation of the Latin bona ad nuntiado. Probably butchered that. It's a translation of the Greek euangelion, reward for bringing good news. See the evangel. Okay, so let's jump into this gospel is a very inappropriate word for what we're working with here. But again, when I teach English as a second language to people who want to become more proficient in not only their English accent in order to work at like call centers or things like that, but also when I give people information, because I mean, it's not like I officially teach that. It's just some people I'll say, hey, look, your accent is really bad. Let me see if I can help you. You know what I mean? But the concept here is that I tell them your alphabet is not my alphabet. How you pronounce letters is not how I pronounce letters. And when you fix that, you actually will be able to communicate better. What does that mean? That means Spanish English is not English. That means that Russian English is not English. It's Russian pronouncing English words. Now, where this becomes important is within language frameworks that it is very hard to actually speak English without understanding the culture of English. Meaning that part of the reason for the mispronunciations of words or letters has to do with the idiomatic attachments to those letters in that language. Now, where this becomes important is that Yeshua was never going to speak to the Jews in a language they didn't understand. Now, I'm not talking about whether he's pronouncing Hebrew or not. That's a different argument that we can get into. He spoke Hebrew, not Aramaic. But the thing is that he definitely spoke their cultural language. Meaning what? Meaning, for example, when we have in Luke, I believe it is chapter 22, verse 20, I think it is. Yeah, in Luke chapter 22, verse 20, it says, and in the same way he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Now, Christianity has made an absolute error in believing that there's anything new going on in that discussion. What I mean by that is that they say, oh, they had no idea what he was talking about. They have no idea what new covenant meant, right? And later on, Peter received revelation, and that's how he knew. No, 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 no. You need to understand something. First and foremost is that you're not going to find information about the new covenant in the New Testament. You're going to find information about it in the Old Testament. Now, here's the significance. Finding information about things in the New Testament should indicate to you that the New Testament is just commentary. What are the Gospels? What are the narratives of Yeshua? And if you still want to call the stories about your Messiah good spells, that's between you and him. But I will tell you that these narratives are just him living his life. And where that becomes important is how he interacts with his reality. He frames things a certain way. He responds to people who, according to Christianity, are going to hell. He responds to people with information about the light, about things that they should not be given information about if they are lost, according to how Christianity operates. Things like the word Holy Spirit, things like the word gospel, things like the word kingdom, things like the word salvation, redemption, deliverance, imputation. Those are all Old Testament concepts in their framework. And now where this becomes really important is to realize that when he says he would do something new, or behold, I've made all things new, or any of the information that Christianity uses to try to say that he revamped the whole system, you are missing a very important context. And that important context is that everything that's contained in the New Testament is actually in the Old Testament first. And you have to know that in order to understand that. You have to know the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings, in order to properly understand the New Testament in its context. Meaning what? You should not be making doctrine off of Paul's response answers to questions in letters that we don't have, and then deciding people's fate upon that, and then treating them a certain way because of your belief about that fate. For example, would you ever go to your pastor and say, I would like to tell you about the gospel of Jesus Christ? Right? No, you wouldn't. Why? Because you assume that he is saved. A very inappropriate assumption, because you do not have the ability to judge that or decide that. You go to a person, you say, when did you make Jesus Lord of your life? And they say, oh, well, I don't think I actually ever did that. Oh, well, let me tell you about the Roman road. And now I'm going to share the gospel with you, Christ and him crucified. In context, you need to know that Christ and him crucified is not the gospel. There's nothing good news about him being tortured and dying on the cross. And furthermore, the imputation that people get caught up in, that he had to die in order for you to be granted a certain thing, is very inappropriate, because God will bestow upon those whom he decides to bestow upon blessing and insight and revelation and all of the other things without any intervention from Yeshua, meaning his death means something else, and you need to get that figured out. Furthermore, it is more important that he rose from the dead, because that affected death all the way back through. Okay? But there's still more. That, in and of itself, is not the good news. And what I am going to show you today is that the convolution and the paradox of the word gospel, that you identify with these four narratives, or worse, that you decide that a person's fate is in your hands as a result of what you say, is a neurosis, a Freudian neurosis. And in principle, what you need to realize is that that particular thing absolves you of certain guilts you feel about yourself. We're not going to get into any of that today. You're going to figure that out on your own, or you're going to contact me and make an appointment. But what I can tell you is that what we are experiencing right now is a complete dereliction of the gospel. Good news, though. There was a certain scribe, which of course, you know, Yeshua, he hated them scribes, so maybe we shouldn't give too much credit to a scribe, who consequently ended up having an entire book of the Bible, and very specifically the Tanakh, not the 66-book compendium of the anti-Semitic councils of the Protestant Reform, but instead, somebody in the Old Testament actually did something to the Bible as he knew it in such a significant way as to give us the answer. And here is the simplicity of this. Ezra, the scribe, divided the Torah, not the Tanakh, not the 66-book compendium, but only the Torah, into sections to be read in the marketplace daily. He divided it up into weekly and then daily readings that would be read in the marketplace. And then on the Shabbat, he established a tradition and habitual practice for the Israelites, or should I say specifically for the Jews, to what? To teach about what was being taught on Shabbat in what would be eventually called the synagogue, meaning what? The learning place that contains everyone. That's really what that means, which was the square where the market normally would have been, except that Nehemiah closed the gates because the merchants, who were not obviously believers because they wouldn't be carrying burdens on Shabbat, were excluded from bringing in their wares on the Shabbat, who consequently was, I shouldn't say who, which consequently was very specifically practiced on a very specific day as a result of when the manna fell, which was last week's portion. Go back and watch the midrashes concerning last week's portion. Now, where we get into the meat of this is that Yitro, this particular parasha, which consequently is going to be made up of the information of Moses' father-in-law showing up, the people moving from the wilderness to the wilderness, I'm sorry, from the wilderness into the place where Mount Sinai was, and at Mount Sinai receiving information, confessing some things, and then receiving the Ten Commandments and some very important communications given within all of that. So basically, Moses' father-in-law shows up and gives some delegation information, and then Moses arrives at Mount Sinai, goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, and the people get information, make decisions. All of a sudden, here comes the Ten Commandments, and we're done with that parasha. However, contained within this parasha is something very, very powerful. And that is that there is information given. Now, I'm going to share something with you. There are people in Torah observant circles, very specifically rabbinical Torah observant circles, who want to exclude the book of Hebrews from the New Testament canon as a result of what appears to be some contradictory information. And of course, if you don't really understand or have a security, or better yet, have a contentedness within your belief, Hebrews can be very challenging to a Messianic. And the reason for that is because there's a number of things that indicate certain things happen with the temple, etc., that on its face seem to have not happened. Unless you read Talmud and understand what information is given in Talmud, Hebrews appears to be outside of the scope of the New Testament canon. I'm not going to get into the why behind that, but I'm going to introduce something to you from Hebrews that is an extremely controversial thing, and I'm going to share with you how it came about for me. So a couple of things you need to know right off the bat. The first one is that however much I have a desire to do other things like hike and program computers and help people with their businesses and all that, I am stuck on stupid on the Bible. And what I mean by that is I'm addicted to the thing. And I can tell you, I have exhausted it in so many levels, and I know I haven't even touched the surface. Okay? But what I can tell you is that back in, I would say this maybe was 2014, 2013, I had gone to the park with a friend. And while I was in the park with that friend, we were discussing the gospel. And we were discussing the Sabbath. And so very specifically, we're discussing Hebrews chapter 3. And there is something you need to know about that. What you need to know is that within Hebrews chapter 3 is a discussion about entering into God's rest, right? And then kind of a mention about the hardening of the heart, right? So, and actually, I mean, I think chapter 2 is actually where there's a discussion about the Sabbath per se, but that part about hardening your heart is very, very important. So, first and foremost, what we need to talk about is that if we find in any way a reference to the Old Testament in the New Testament, it would be imperative that you become an expert on that subject before you continue trying to interpret the New Testament. What do I mean by that? If Paul or the writer of Hebrews or Peter or whoever makes a reference to the Old Testament, as we like to call it, when it's actually the law, the prophets, and the writings, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. That's how Yeshua referred to it on the road to Emmaus. That's how a number of people in the fifth gospel, which consequently would be the book of Acts, references it. I can tell you it was actually anti-Semitic heretic who suggested that it be called the Old and New Testament. But we don't need to get into that today. I've spoke plenty on that, and you could go watch my videos and identify that stuff. But what's really important here is that we identify information about what we're going to encounter about the gospel in Hebrews chapter 3. So I'm gonna come here to, I'm gonna say verse I'm gonna say verse, well, we'll just read from verse 1. Therefore, oh darn it, now we got to go back, don't we? Okay, so let's go back to the last paragraph mentioned here. And very specifically, we're going to go, oh, therefore, darn it, we got to go back some more. Oh, we got to go back some more. Let's see, where's the next paragraph? Oh, man, we need to go back some more. Okay. Okay, so you see what's happening here. One thing is being built upon another. And let me explain. If you read something in the New Testament, and the reason I'm saying New Testament is because that's what will get your brain locked into Greek. You are not Greek. Yeshua was not Greek, okay? So utilizing the Greek language to try to describe Hebraic values, culture, language, idiomatic usage is impossible, okay? So one of the things you need to know is that the Greek has a tendency to use a process of connection from one subject to the next, to the next, to the next, using this Greek word, dia, or the Greek word gar, depending on what it is. Now, dia is more of something to do with a preposition, which I can tell you means to go through, okay? But gar is more of a causative. And so when we encounter dia or gar, we are encountering a continuation, or what we would call a conjunctive connection to the last verse. So when you see therefore, you probably need to go back and see what's going on there. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to a statement, okay? And what we're going to say here is, let's see, I think I want to use verse 14. Let's go there. Okay. So this is what it says. It says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had power of death, and that is the devil. I'm not going to get into who the devil is, but if you think that he is some guy running around in red pajamas with a pitchfork and a pointy tail and has 7 rings of hell to descend into should you be naughty, you are seriously mistaken. But let's keep going. And might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. For assuredly he does not give help to the angels, but he gives help to the descendants of Abraham, which we're going to get into the gospel of Abraham today. Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. What a horrible word. You know, I got to tell you, propitiation is one of the most ridiculous things I have ever had to deal with when it comes to dealing with word for word translations. But the premise behind propitiation just has to do with the idea of a substitutionary sacrifice, which consequently we probably need to get into someday. But you can also go back and watch my video, How to Satiate a God, in order to really understand propitiation on the level it needs to be understood. For since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is also come to the aid of those who are tempted. Okay. Now, moving to chapter 3, verse 1, now we understand the context of the therefore that we really need to get our heads wrapped around. And says, therefore, holy brethren. I'm not going to get into that right now. Partakers of a heavenly calling. Consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. Oh my gosh, what horrible, horrible wording. Just because I know the Greek here. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house. Interesting context of Moses, right? For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. Question, and this is a rhetorical one. Why all of a sudden is Moses being brought up? We'll find out here in a minute, but I can tell you there's another little nugget in there that if you recognize it, you'll understand why Moses was specifically brought up. But let's keep going. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and boast of our hope firm until the end. Next, therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as when they provoked me, as in the day of the trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with this generation and said, they all go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. You see that big, bold, or I'm sorry, you see that all caps stuff going on there? That is a New American Standard Bible formatting that lets you know that this is an Old Testament verse. This is a Tanakh verse. And I think right here, well, maybe down in the footnotes. Let's take a look here. Nope. Okay. So I think what's important now is that we would need to find out, oh, there it is, in Psalm 95, 7 through 11. So let me share a little secret with you that a lot of people don't know. Moses wrote Psalm 95. In fact, Moses wrote, I believe it's Psalm 90 through 105, which means, maybe it's 102, which means that what we have here is a reference to Moses because of this psalm. Okay, so let's go back into this now. And therefore I was angry with the generation. Okay, let's go here. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God, but encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today. Oh my gosh, there's so much power in that right there. So that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. While it is said today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as when they provoked me. Here we go. This is so important right here. For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? and with whom he was angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. Now, this message is not about unbelief. This message is not about faith. And this message is not about belief, nor is it about the Greek word pistos, which consequently plays a very important role here, which you may want to go research. Okay. But what it does do is let us know who chapter 4 is about to be talking about, because chapter 4 is powerful. And here is the piece that is so important. These people that we are discussing are the ones who tested him in the wilderness, who walked for 40 years in the wilderness and saw his works. That's what it says in the upper part of 3. Now we need to remember that what's being discussed here is that Yeshua assists those who are disobedient, but he does not assist those who do not believe. Now we need to go ahead and just stick a pin in that, because we do not want to get into the absolute mind-blowing discussion about faith that has nothing to do with creed. Okay? Has nothing to do with whether or not somebody has named Jesus as Lord, right? Okay. So, and I will tell you, I want to say this really quick, because I know that some people see some of my sarcasm and become frustrated or offended. I need to make something clear. That is to get you to think about the problem, not to label me as the problem, because the problem starts at the Council of Nicaea and works itself forward. Actually, the Edict of Milan and works its way forward all the way to the Council of Trent. Go research what happened at the Council of Trent between Cardinal Regalio and Luther, and you will see something amazing come up. What's mentioned at the end of chapter 4, I believe it is. But regardless, the point being is that it's actually a discussion about the Shabbat, about the Sabbath, which consequently is a subject that comes up a lot in the councils, along with the feast days, along with the proper use of language and other things, and of course the canons, and of course this ridiculous construct called the Trinity. All right. Now, moving into chapter 4. Therefore, let us fear while a promise remains of entering his rest. Any one of you may seem to have come short, lest any one of you may have seemed to have come short of it. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also, but the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. Okay, stop. Right there, stop. Before you get caught up in believing that that is Christ and him crucified, I want you to think about what these particular people who tested God, which means it's not the generation who went into the promised land, because they did not fall in the wilderness after 40 years. So what we're working with here is the people from the Red Sea to the promised land refusal, and what played a role in all of their interactions with God. Because by the time we get to the promised land refusal, he says, you have tested me these 10 times. Meaning what? Meaning the tests that drove God to say, they're not going to enter my rest, has to do with everything that happened up until that point from when they left the Red Sea, which means that last week's parasha plays a role, this week's parasha plays a role, and truth be told, all the parashas up until the parasha in which they did not enter the promised land that first time plays a role. Moses writes this psalm and says, look, man, they saw my works for 40 years and still didn't believe. almost indicating that he didn't have to die, but yet that's another discussion, perhaps for Midrash. But I really want to get at here is that we need to make an adjustment on the word gospel. Well, one of the ways that we can do that, obviously, is by actually working with the word here in a different context. So first and foremost, when we go into this word system of good news, one of the things that we need to do is just come over here and paste this into a search. And then what I would like to do is go ahead and let's see. We'll just leave it like that. I want to say maybe glad tidings, but let's stick with good news and see where we go with it. Let me see if that's where we want to be. So then, of course, he says, you carry good news, the house of their idols and the people. Let's take a look at this now. This Hebrew word is basar, okay? To bear good news, to bear tidings, publish, preach, show forth, right? So let's stop there. Two things. When Paul gets busted in the temple for keeping Torah after Yeshua died and ends up requesting in Greek to speak to the people, does he speak to them in Greek? No, he does not. He addresses the soldier in Greek and then speaks to the people in what? Not Aramaic, Hebrew. Okay? And so what you need to realize is that the people responded to a Hebrew framework of language. Remember earlier I said, your alphabet is not my alphabet. Your idioms are not my idioms. You take the Spanish language and its idioms and now try to speak English, and you apply all that is the preciousness of the Spanish language to the English language. You miss the English idioms, you miss the English pronunciations, and therefore you actually are not speaking the language. You're just pronouncing words the way you pronounce words. What's my point? My point is that proper framework of language is important, and Yeshua was not speaking something new to the people. He was speaking their language framework. And so is Paul here when he's addressing the people in the temple. And so what we need to accept is that anywhere that you see the word gospel in the New Testament, it's the word basar. And very specifically, Besorah. Besorah is actually the Hebrew word we're looking for here. Now, that has a very different idiomatic connection to reality than any other piece when it comes to saying that word gospel in the English. You need to know the translations that this went through. So it goes from Yeshua's native language of Hebrew to after the Hadrian law, after Emperor Hadrian makes it to where people cannot go to Jerusalem if they're a Jew, to a Babylonian occupation, including the city of Antioch, where they were more Aramaic based, to a Greek translation for those who were not Hebrews to begin with, but as they became a convert to the Jewish sect of the Way, began to understand the Hebraic language, because you cannot translate it into Greek. From Greek to Latin, from Latin to German, from German to English. If you can't get your mind wrapped around that the word gospel does not mean what you think it is, just kind of think about it in terms of if the president of the United States called somebody on the other side of the world in and gave them information, and then they gave that information to somebody else in their language, that's already going to be a breakdown in information. But now we're going to take that same language and we're going to call somebody else on the other side of the world and explain it in that language using those translations. And then now that information, by the time we're done, we've nuked the world. And you cannot deny that that's true. You cannot deny that there is a difference. I can tell you right now, one of the things I ask if I'm sitting with somebody who, say, speaks Spanish or speaks Portuguese, and I ask them, do you know what it means to let the cat out of the bag? They're like, well, you got to go chase the cat, right? They don't know the idiom, and therefore that translation doesn't work. You have to translate it that they told a secret. And so you could see where there's a language breakdown here. So we go back to what Yeshua spoke, and it wasn't Aramaic. Okay, so as we're going back to what Yeshua spoke, here's where we're at. Okay, basar, right? First usage of basar as an idea of good news is actually this verse. Okay, so what we need to do is contextually take a look at this verse really quick, right? So first of all, let's take a look at it. What is this particular piece of information? Let's say that we go here. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make a sport of me. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Now Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. When the men of Israel were on the other side of the valley with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in them. And it came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news. Okay? That's the first use of the word basar. That's the first use of the word gospel. So now what we need to do is understand that in principle, the Greek is trying to communicate this concept of good news. But here we see the word gospel being used about a uncircumcised enemy. We know enemy of God because David calls them the enemies of God. Okay. Now that doesn't seem like they were always that way if we look at what Abimelech accomplished, but let's just go with this current group that they are the enemies of God according to David. And so in principle, as we start to look at this idea, we can accept that good news does not have anything to do, or the word gospel, which we could superimpose here, because I'm willing to bet it's very possible that the word euangelion is used in the Septuagint. Let's just check. Let's see if that concept is true. Going into it here we are right here in this particular section. That is the good news, right? Let's take a look at it. Gospel. Okay. In fact, we can go into there and we can see right here. Now, Here's something very important that you need to realize. What did I say about the NASB? The NASB causes what? All caps to be Old Testament. The poor have the gospel preached to them. Well, we know that this particular passage has something to do with Isaiah, right? We know that Isaiah 61 verse that talks about preaching the good news, right? The Besorah. Now, here is the part that is important when we are looking at this system. The system of Hebraic process within the context of the Jews who Yeshua is going to speak a language framework to them, not Gentile Christians in the year 2026, but Jews in the first century, which means what? We're working with Mishnah, we're working with pre-Talmudic information, rabbinic authorities such as Rabbi Shammai, rabbinic authorities such as Rabbi Hillel. The formation and the information behind that formation of the Pharisees versus the Sadducees versus the Essenes versus the Zealots versus the Herodians versus the Hellenists. Oh my gosh, if you do not have that information, you have no business even trying to read and make doctrine. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it is imperative that a person go and read the Gospels. And I think it's imperative that they learn what their Messiah did, because if there's anything that is clear, he kept the feasts, he kept Torah, he did all these things, and they go, it's because he was Jewish. Okay, so the creator of Judaism is sitting there keeping the things of Judaism, then perhaps maybe we might need to look at why he did all that, right? But here's the part that is absolutely imperative to this information, and that is that the gospel that was received by us, according to the book of Hebrews, was also given to those who were in the wilderness from Red Sea to the rejection of entering the promised land. That is the context. That is the frame. So you go from there to there, and somewhere in there is a gospel that they hear but do not receive by faith. Now, again, I'm not going to get into faith because it's not what you think it is. And if you don't read it correctly, you will mistakenly apply it and become biased in your information, as has been the translational bias of the New Testament for years. Okay? But here's the part that's so important, is this particular gospel is tied into this week's parasha. And here's the part that's even more important, is you're trained on what it means and how important it is. And that's where your head is just going to go kaboom. Because truth be told, is what you've understood about the gospel up until today has been a narrative used to not only control the masses, which we've talked about before, but also to exclude certain individuals who appear to buck the system. And a construct is created to scare people. And then this particular word gospel is used as information to exclude certain people from certain treatment of each other, but also to identify a horrible, horrible thing, that they're in purgatory or they're in hell. I have witnessed on multiple occasions Christian friends who go to funerals and mourn for the loved one that has died because they believe they went to hell. And then they go through this whole phase of grief where they try to convince themselves that maybe, I love this, this one drives me absolutely crazy, maybe somebody witnessed to him in the hospital before they died. Oh my God. Are you seriously thinking that you have the ability through your creed, which was established in an anti-Semitic manner, to determine something about what your Messiah, who's Jewish and Semitic, did or worked with on behalf of that person? You don't understand. You don't use a creed to determine whether someone is worthy of their healing. Yeshua didn't. You don't use a creed to determine whether somebody is worthy of the treatment of say, communication with, say, the Holy Spirit or whatever. You don't get to determine that. And if you can't get your head wrapped around that, you need to go read Acts 10 and 11 and stop interpreting it that you can eat sodium nitrate infused pork bellies, because you can't. You were told not to. And there'll be a spanking for you when he comes back. So in principle, that's Isaiah 66, by the way, you can go read it. So in principle, we need to accept that the concept of gospel is not contained in such a way that when John the Baptist comes on the scene and says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that they did not know what he was talking about. And furthermore, when it says that Yeshua went through and preached the gospel of the kingdom, because one of the things I want to show you is that the word gospel first appears in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23. And I want to read that to you real quick so that we can identify some things. Yeshua was going throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every sickness among the people. Okay? Now, in addition to healing people of their sicknesses and of their diseases, which means that it could have just been something simple, or it could have been something terminal, and in addition goes to their synagogues and goes throughout Galilee doing it, that he is speaking the gospel of the kingdom. And of course, NASB, let me show you this. This is an example of where we get into some problems. Look at this. Why is this footnote here? Why does it say good news instead of gospel? Because the gospel of the kingdom would be contrary to the gospel of Christ and him crucified. In fact, there's a huge discussion among fundamentalist Christians as to what gospel needs to be preached by whom. Paul preached the gospel, you're supposed to preach a gospel, and Yeshua preached the gospel, and those are three different things. Oh boy, that's exhausting. Okay, so in context with everything, what we need to do then is accept that there has to be some connection between what you hear and what they heard. And I can tell you, I've done a lot of research on this. And the reason behind this was, of course, because me and my friend were walking and talking, and I just so happened to only have on me a Gideon's New Testament. Now, I was very much already had become Torah observant and very apologetic in my understanding. However, one of the things that was going on is we were just trying to understand the Sabbath, and he brought up Hebrews, and I read in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 2, that specific part, and I said, oh my gosh, what did they hear? If this is talking about that the entering into the promised land is some sort of rest, and now that rest is Yeshua, and that rest is Sabbath, but somehow it's Yeshua, we need to find out who heard what. Because it says this same gospel that was preached to us was preached to them. Well, what was preached to them? Okay? Well, there's two things that are very important. The first one is that from the moment of the Red Sea until the rejection, because remember, our framework is what is in chapter 3. Chapter 3 says they hardened their hearts as in the days of testing. I was angry with that generation for 40 years, though they saw my works for those 40 years, which locks in the generation who would fall in the wilderness, which locks them from Red Sea to entering the promised land and refusing to enter. Where does this become so important? Well, first of all, and this is really, really significant, is what was said to them and what was communicated to them. So what we need to look at, we need to look at the 10 commandments. We need to look at all of the commandments that were given from chapter 23 onward to like chapter 26, probably the construction of the tabernacle, the information about the Nazarite, the information about the bitter waters, the information about the numbering, etc., etc., etc. But all of those are commandments that end up being called Torah later on. Nothing in there appears to be good news. It all appears to be instruction. For example, the people cry out because they don't have food. Manna falls, and instruction is given about how to deal with the manna. Water gets given to them, and instruction is given about the provision of God concerning them. And in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, we find that he let them hunger and thirst for a reason, right? Quail is given, etc. That's all last week's parasha. So we go from Red Sea splitting to quail given and the little minor incident that occurs with the quail. But the premise is that that's all the information we have to that point. Now, getting into this week's parasha, we have other information. And over and over and over again, I have sought to try to find any information indicating a gospel. My problem in the beginning was I was looking for a narrative about the Messiah because I'd been pre-programmed to believe that the good news is Christ come and him crucified. But the problem here is that is an inappropriate doctrinal interpretation of Basar and Besorah. In fact, our particular verse in chapter 11 that we just looked at said that the gospel or the good news was preached to a certain people, right? And that's coming from Isaiah 61. Now, we could get into all kinds of information about what Isaiah 61 is actually presenting. But again, that's another thing. Number one, you probably need to research. But what will really affect your brain is the fact that the gospel is not only presented in this parasha, which consequently is Genesis 18:1 to 20 verse 23, I believe it is, and it is the parasha Yitro, for those of you who study the parashas, which Ezra created when he created the answer to our question, what is the gospel? Now, that was 2014 when I discovered this. And since I have been the primary teacher of After His Heart Ministries, I have communicated this over and over and over again, that this is what the gospel is. Stop calling those narratives the gospel and stop thinking that it is Christ and him crucified, and do yourself a favor and stop using that as an excuse to exclude people from your secret squirrel club. Okay? But now it gets big. Because what I didn't know then and know now is that the entire parasha contains the elements of the gospel in a certain manner. Okay? So let's start at the beginning. What we need to do is we need to accept that either Peter or Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Whoever wrote the book of Hebrews had to have been a Pharisee because he uses the code word brethren, which was a code word that they used to identify that they were a Pharisee writing to Pharisees. And no one else was allowed to really get their heads wrapped around because, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say no one was allowed to, but no one really knew what was being spoken of except for them because they had doctrines established, which consequently now becomes the Talmud later on, and of course the rabbinical authority. Now, what's important here, though, is the fact that whoever this is knows about the temple. Okay. And not only do they know about the temple, but they also know about the priesthood. And they know a lot about the priesthood and a lot about the temple, which is indicative that probably Paul may have written it. However, there is something very important present in Peter's letters that could indicate that he wrote it. And that's where we need to go next. We need to go look at Peter. Okay. So we're going to go actually to First Peter chapter 5 verse let's see, I think it is probably going to be, no, but it's not 5. It is going to be, hold on one second, having a technical difficulty with my tablet here. um, um, sorry, First Peter chapter 2 verse 5. That's where I was messed up here. Okay, so and I still I still went to, okay, here we go. First Peter chapter 2 verse 5 mentions something very important. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Okay, we will get to that in a minute, but what I want you to see is verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now, where people get hung up on this is they don't realize the problem with the Greek here. But notice something important. It's bold. And it's bold because that is a very specific verse in a very specific place in a very specific context that is so important to your life that if you neglect it or you cease to understand it correctly, you are going to be in serious error, both of doctrine, of interaction with human beings, and your own self improvement. Yeah, it's that serious. Okay, so getting back to verse 9, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. Remember, I said that the gospel was somewhere hidden in this parasha. So let's go to the beginning of this parasha in Exodus chapter 18, and we see Moses' father-in-law comes in. But then in 19, we see them arrive at Mount Sinai. Okay, and when they arrive at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up to God. That's ascension or elevation, and Yahweh calls to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel," which means what? He's including people who are not walking in the covenant of Israel and who are walking in the covenant of Israel. Oh, interesting. A non-covenanted people versus a covenanted people. Intriguing. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. Okay? So he's the God of this world. That's an interesting reference. Okay, but before I get into verse 6, which is so important that you are not going to be the same after you watch this video, I want to address something here. First and foremost, was there not already made a covenant with Israel through Jacob concerning Jacob's descendants in the parasha about the ladder? So Jacob falls asleep, sees the ladder, hears these things, God declares these things, Jacob wakes up and declares some things. Okay? Jacob is the first one and the only one to have really listened to God and accepted and identified his position on the covenant. Okay? In other words, he stated terms. But those terms were actually acceptance and not necessarily a demand. So basically, God promises these things about his descendants, right? Now, we've been through all kinds of mess about what happened in Egypt and how there was a covenant breakdown, right? But now they've come out of Egypt, they've passed the Red Sea, they've passed the other important things, and now they have arrived at Sinai, and Moses ascends to God and then is called and then is called by God to the mountain. Yeah, you weren't ready for that one yet, but let's just go with this idea. Now then, if you will indeed keep my covenant, we'll get to that. I want to go to Jeremiah chapter 31. And the reason that I do is because that is going to be important to this concept of covenant with this particular people. Jeremiah chapter 31. Going down to verse 31. Long chapter. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant, very important there, which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares Yahweh. Meaning what? Meaning if there was any identification, we'll just jump right back over here. If there was any identification of a covenant, we would probably could identify that the terms of that covenant had something to do with the mention of covenant, right? But furthermore, now we've identified that this my own possession, which consequently is a very special word, when translated into Greek means peculiar, because Greek doesn't have an ability to translate that word. Then you shall be my own possession among the peoples, for all the earth is mine. Now, we will get into the concept of what that means when it says all the peoples, for the earth is mine. But what you really need to see here is that this is a betrothal. Oh, but there's more. Not only is it a betrothal, but in this parasha, you have been given everything that you need to understand about it. And now we move to 6. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Now, what are the terms of the covenant at this point? That you will protect, Shomar. I haven't gotten to that yet, but that you will protect my covenant. But then in Jeremiah, it says they broke it. Meaning what? It was, and he says, although I was a husband to you. So what we need to accept is that this is a marriage covenant, or it has that type of idiomatic value as the new covenant that he was about to make. When it says, behold, the days are coming when a new covenant I will make with the house of Israel, the house of Judah, not like the covenant which they broke. So we need to accept that there's going to be a difference between the two covenants. But what's interesting about it is that the new covenant would have something interesting occur, which we will get into here in a minute. But here is the part that's so very, very, very important, and that is, these are the words you shall speak to the sons of Israel, or those who are faithful to the Israelite covenant made with Jacob, or the Jacobian covenant. Okay? Now, when I asked you what was the gospel of Moses, this is it. Moses says, if you will guard my covenant, you shall be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, right? And my own possession, or a peculiar people. Okay? Now, before we go back to Peter, and before we accept and agree that this is the only reference to something in the New Testament that's also in the Old Testament, that's in the confines of that window that we spoke about, that is indicative of good news, then you would understand the power behind this, the system in place here. Now we're going to take it a step further, because we're going to go look at this concept of that the good news was preached and that reference in Isaiah. But what I want you to get at here is that they would be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, and a peculiar people. Now, what's important to understand about this is that that peculiarness is the uniqueness of it. Meaning what? It would not worship me. This is Deuteronomy 12. Do not worship me the way the nations worship their gods. Don't learn their customs. Oh, and then in Jeremiah chapter 10, it says the same thing. Don't learn their customs, because this is what they do. Now, as to whether or not Jeremiah chapter 10 is about a Christmas tree, let's just leave that alone for a minute. I need you to remember something very important. And that is that as I am sarcastic and trying to provoke you to think and whatever, I want you to know also that I'm very compassionate with the fact that you actually have a desire to love God. Not one of my Christian friends is a polytheistic, bloodletting demon worshiper. Okay? But the customs of the nations definitely create a problem, especially when it says that if someone comes along saying, let us do this instead of Torah, that you are not supposed to have pity for them. In other words, if someone says, hey, we can go eat sodium nitrate and fruit infused smoke cured pork bellies, you're wrong. You can't. And again, that's in Isaiah 66, where you're going to get a spanking when he comes back. Okay. So in principle, then, what we need to ask is, why does Peter say you have become, versus in Exodus 19, you will be? What was the condition? Covenant, right? And that particular covenant had with it a requirement that you keep it. Now, according to Yahweh in Jeremiah chapter 31, they broke it sufficient enough that he needed to make a new one, right? Now, I know there's a bunch of people out there, lots of Torah observants, lots of whole Bible believers, lots of messianics who want to make that Chadash be renewed. And I get that. And I honor that. But first we got to understand what is the difference, because he says it's not like the one that I made with your fathers when I brought them out of Egypt, right, with a strong hand, a covenant which they broke, even though that I was a husband to them. Now, The next piece of this puzzle that we need to get into then, and I know I'm just gonna say this. That word husband is Baal in the Hebrew, which means master, and we could get into all kinds of stuff about that. But instead, let's not get caught up in that particular detail, because husband and master don't have too much of a difference when it comes to the information that follows, which says, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel, a covenant. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel, in that I will write my Torah, that's the law in the Hebrew, Torah, upon their hearts. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. No longer shall one say to another, do you know Yahweh? For all will know me, from the least to the greatest of these, meaning what? There's a huge element of this covenant that doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of what Marcion eventually wanted to call the New Testament or New Covenant, so that we get people who go and they read a Gideon's New Testament and have a big piece of the Bible missing, and don't realize that contained within that particular little compendium of the New Testament and the Psalms is everything they need to understand about it because of Hebrews and Peter. So, did Peter write Hebrews? I don't know, but I can tell you he has decided that the gospel is the kingdom of priests, holy nation, and peculiar people. But how is it that he says they have become it? And this says they will become it if they keep his covenant. What does that mean about Peter's statement? That whatever it was, that criteria needed to be met in order to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation had occurred. And that particular thing that was stated according to right here is Shomer or Shomar, my covenant. Okay? All right. So the next thing then that we necessarily need to do is look a little bit at the Hebrew here, right? So let's go into this. And you want to go to my covenant, and very specifically down here, when we go to this, we're going to say, I'm sorry, wrong verse. Up one. There we go. Right there. That is that word barit, right? Covenant, pledge, or alliance, coming from the root word bara, which means to eat or consume. Okay, not going to get into that quite yet. And then it is very similar to bara, which is to create, shape, or form. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In fact, let's just go ahead and do that real quick. Boink, 1:1, Genesis 1:1, here's that word bara, okay? Going back to bara, which is the verbal form of berit, which means to consume or eat something, right? And then we've got this berit, which is covenant, berit, okay? Or in the Ashkenazi, bris. All right. So at any rate, covenant, alliance, or pledge. Now, we're not going to get into the context of this yet. And we may not touch upon it today, but what I wanted to show you is that eating part. For those of you who want to understand that, go watch How to Satiate a God. Okay, now getting into the context of keep, we're going to go with shamar. Now, let me make a statement about this. In the modern Hebrew today, shomer is actually a reference to a police officer. Okay, so I want you to think about this in terms of true guardianship in the sense of like marching back and forth, guarding something. Okay, not guardianship in the sense of what people would think, like keeping the feast means to actually carry out the commandment of feast. but instead to guard it. Now, in modern Hebrew, very unfortunately, if somebody is somebody who does not honor the commandments of Shabbat, which include the rabbinical fence of, say, maybe, I don't know, turning on a oven during the Sabbath by kindling a fire, they say, I am not Shomer Shabbat. I am not a keeper of the Sabbath. I don't honor that particular rule. But that is not a correct use of the instance of that word. So when we instantiate that word into this concept of my covenant, it is not doing the commandments. It is guarding them. Okay? So we'll get more into that concept of guarding them in a minute. But what I want you to understand is that whatever the criteria was stated here in chapter 19 is not lost to Peter. Peter understands that whatever needed to be in place was in place as criteria for this covenant. Now, the intrigue is that people go, oh, but it says new covenant, and it says not like the one that he made. Okay, we could get into that. We could go and say, okay, what's different about them? But that's not what Peter does. And I say that considering the fact that Peter was kind of friends with Yeshua, that he probably had some insight that we're not necessarily privy to, and we might want to just jive with him on it. In other words, he had concluded that whatever needed to happen had happened, and now we were that thing. Of course, whoever he's writing to, which consequently we don't really know who he was writing to, but we infer the probability that we could be included in his talk, right? Okay, so what we need to do is go back to Peter, right? Okay, so as we go back to Peter, and you guys don't even know this, but we haven't even got into the meat yet. Okay, so we go back to Peter chapter 5, verse 1. Okay, I'm sorry, not chapter 5, chapter 2. Boy, I've done that a lot. Okay, here we go. Therefore, putting aside all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, like newborn babies, long for pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. Oh, that would be a big question. How do you grow in salvation? Yeah, you better think twice if you think that salvation is a one-time situation and that it has anything to do with hell. If you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. Interesting. Okay. If we tasted that the Lord is kind, here we go. And coming to him as living stones which have been rejected by men. I'm sorry, coming to him as a living stone which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, isn't it interesting that what we have here is a context that people who practice malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander are like babies. Now, what you don't know is the power behind that reference, which we'll get into. However, we are to long for the pure milk, or I'm sorry, who long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. Now, I'm not going to get into the idea of growing in salvation, because somewhere along the lines we're going to have to accept that means that there's some sort of progressiveness to it, which means that even if you bought into the doctrine of hell, there was a possibility of a way out. Now, having said all that, I think it's also very important that we don't miss this concept that Peter has identified, that whatever it is that needed to meet the criteria, met the criteria, so that in verse 9, we are dealing with what we have become. So it's interesting. For you were not a people, but now are the people of God. Oh, that's a reference to Hosea, which is interesting because then that gets into the divorce of Israel, which we can also deal with. But the premise is beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. And of course, immediately people identify has something to do with sexuality. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. Wait a minute. I thought you were Gentiles. Okay. I'll let that go. All right. So at any rate, here we go. So that the thing in which they slander you as evildoers may be because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Okay, that was a mouthful. But the premise is that we do not see anywhere where this seems to be that the criteria was met. But let's just take a look here. For this is contained in the scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone. He who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value then is for who believe, but not for those who disbelieve. Ooh, that sounds like Hebrews chapter 4, verse 2. A hint that maybe Peter wrote Hebrews. But let's just keep going. The stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, for they stumble because they are disobedient to the word. And to this doom they were appointed. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, blah, blah, blah. So what's interesting is it says that they stumbled because they are disobedient to the word. Now, for those of you who need an understanding that don't have it, the Word of God is not the 66 book compendium that the Protestant Reformation synods identified as canonical, but instead is whatever it was that was being complained about in this particular verse and information, because again, we have what? We have big capital letters stating that this is the most important, I'm sorry, not most important, this is the Old Testament, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. So let's just do this. Let's just put in stone of stumbling and see if we get a direct reference. Let me fix that. There we go. Isaiah, good old Isaiah. So let's take a look here. Let's take a look at what we are actually going to be working with here. Be broken, O peoples. Be shattered and give ear, all remote places of the earth. Gird yourselves and be shattered. Gird yourselves and be shattered. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. Interesting, right? For thus the Lord spoke to me with mighty power and instructed me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, you are not to say it is a conspiracy in regard to all that this people call a conspiracy, and you are not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. It is Yahweh of hosts whom you should regard as holy, and he shall be your fear and he shall be your dread. Then he shall become a sanctuary, but both the houses of Israel, to both the houses of Israel, a stone to strike and a rock to stumble over, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Many will stumble over them. They will fall and be broken. They will be snared and caught. But bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. Let's just take a look at that word in the Hebrew real quick. Bind up the testimony and seal the Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to just do that to your head. Torah among my disciples. And I will wait for Yahweh, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will even look eagerly for him. Behold, I and the children whom our Yahweh's has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from Yahweh of hosts, who dwells in Mount Zion. Do you guys see here this rock that we stumble over is Yeshua? But then he says, for those who are his disciples, to seal the Torah among them. Do you think it's possible? And I will get back to this in a moment, because one of the things we have a problem with is what we think the Word of God is, and what Peter is saying here is about the Bible, when it's actually the Torah. And here's the crazy part is, it is this week's Parasha Yitro, which gives us a huge revelation. I haven't even got into it yet, because I've had to first prove to you that the gospel is not what you think it is. But now I'm going to take it a step further and say that this entire Parasha contains everything that you need to understand about it. So bind up the testimony and seal the Torah among my disciples. Interesting. And here's one of the things I want you to think about. What disciples are we talking about? Are we talking about Isaiah's disciples? Are we talking about Yahweh's disciples? Are we talking about Yeshua's disciples because of the mention of the stumbling stone? It says in verse 15, many will stumble over them, then they will fall and be broken. They will even be snared and caught. And then it says to bind up the testimony and seal the law among my disciples, which consequently we know that the Ark of the Covenant was called the Ark of the Testimony. Okay. And furthermore, we know that overcoming the dragon has something to do with the word of our testimony. But we're going to go a step further in this, in that what we need to understand is if there was some sort of reference that we could tap into here, let's just take a look at this. Remember, I stopped in verse 18. Behold, I and the children whom Yahweh has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from Yahweh of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. When they say to you, consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? Look at this. In verse 22, the teaching? No, to the Torah and to the testimony, if they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. They will pass through the land hard pressed and famished. It will turn out that they are hungry. They will be enraged and curse their king and their God as they face upward. Then they will look to the earth and behold distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be driven away into darkness. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like what this is saying is that if you do not seal Torah into the testimony of the disciples, then we will have a problem with famished people and hungry people, and they'll be cursed. Oh, and they'll curse God, and they will look to the earth and behold distress and darkness and gloom. Oh my gosh. Are you sure? Are you sure that the Torah has been done away with? All right, let's keep going. So for those of you who do not need to be convinced that the Torah is still present in your current operation, thank you for being patient, because those of you who know this already are about to get the nugget. Moses' father-in-law comes to the camp of Israel, bringing his daughter and Moses' son. And when he brings them, Jethro dwells among them for a while and notices that Moses is doing something. He's sitting on a very specific seat, and that very specific seat is considered like the seat of judgment. And what he's doing is he's listening to civil cases and listening to violations of Torah to determine the magnitude of what needs to happen in order to come back into alignment. It says that he was teaching people. In fact, let's go ahead and just read that one section there real quick. Okay. Now, Yitro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and all Israel, his people, and how Yahweh had brought Israel out of Mitzrayim. Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom and Moshe, said, I have been a sojourner in the foreign land. The other was named Eleazar, and he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Then Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, and there he was camped at the Mount of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Yitro, am coming to you with your wife and 2 sons with her. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed, kissed him. They asked of each other's welfare, and they went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law of all that Yahweh had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. Now I'm going to skip down here because we don't necessarily need to know all that. Okay. But then it says, it came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from the morning until evening. Now, when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, what is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, and all the people stand about you from morning till evening? Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. That's important here. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor and make known the statutes of God and his Torah, or his laws. Moses' father-in-law says to him, the thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which you are to walk and the work they are to do. Furthermore, you shall select out of the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and shall place them as leaders of thousands, pay attention now, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Let them judge the people at times, and let them be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, God so commands, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their place in peace. Now, I think it is important in this that we look at Deuteronomy in a minute. But let me first say this. What you don't realize is that this is Torah, which is instruction for you. Paul said it was written for you, not for them. Moses is just living his life. Jethro is just living his life. And I'll call him Moses and Jethro. They are not writing the Torah. And furthermore, the Torah being written about them is not a mechanism of their life, but a record of their life that becomes our instruction, which should make you think very, very deeply about what your life is as an instruction to somebody who will read about you later on. think about it. I want you to think about some of the greats of faith, right? Some of my favorites, John Newton, right? Not William Miller. Oh man, I can't remember his last name now. And let's see. Oh, the guy who wrote It Is Well With My Soul. Can't remember his name right now. But the premise is that these guys are greats of faith, right? But each one of their lives affects us now. How many of you know by heart Amazing Grace? How many of you know the story of Amazing Grace? How many of you know the life of John Newton? That is Torah. Okay. But now we take it a step further. And what's interesting is the disciples noticed this and did the same thing, which was that they needed to not have to deal with the administrative elements of the spiritual journey they were in. The disciples take and they say, you know what? We need to distribute food to the poor, but we also need to teach this stuff. And since we need to teach the gospel, oh, that's an interesting one, we need someone else to administer to the people. And so they hired, or they didn't hire, but they called in, Philip and Stephen and a number of others, I think Dorcas or something like that. And then the concept is then we have on the other side of this thing that they needed to continue in teaching. And this is what Yitro says, you need to continue in teaching and delegate this other administrative stuff to somebody else. But what's really, really important here is the promise that Yahweh made to the people if they kept Torah. Now, what does Yitro say? He says anybody who actually protects the commandments is who you should bring in, right? Those who do not like dishonest gain, right? And whose hearts are toward God. Now, here's the part that's interesting about this. When Yitro recommends this to Moses, he does say something in there. He says, if God commands you to do this. Now, we're going to get back to that in a minute. But what's really important is to realize that all of these people who would be over the thousands, over the hundreds, over the 50s, and over the tens are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a peculiar people. Meaning what? They are being given a commission because they protected Torah. Okay? Now, here's the part that's interesting about this. We need to remember that the new covenant was the result of a broken covenant because the people did not protect it. But what we can identify is that these particular group of men that are involved in this eldership that we're about to talk about, they are actually protectors of Torah. So now let's get into Deuteronomy chapter 1, okay? In Deuteronomy chapter 1, it says, I spoke to you at that time, saying, I am not able to bear the burden of you alone. Yahweh, your Elohim, has multiplied you, and behold, you are in this day like the stars of heaven in number. May Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, increase you 1,000-fold more than you are, and bless you just as he has promised. How can I alone bear the load and burden of you and your strife? Choose wise and discerning and experienced men from your tribes, and I will appoint them as heads. You answered me and said, the thing which you have said is good. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over your leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens, officers for your tribes. Then I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your fellow countrymen and judge righteously between a man and his fellow countrymen, or an alien who is with him. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not fear man, for the judgment is God's. The case is too hard for you. You shall bring it to me, and I will hear it. I commanded you that you should do that at that time. So it's interesting because now we see Moses carrying this out. Okay. And I'm just going to go here really quick. Now, one of the things that you need to know is that Yahweh took a piece of Moses and placed it in those people. Okay? So when we understand that what is actually happening here is that he has taken this piece of Moses's spirit to teach Torah and to judge among the Israelites, and places it upon these men who are able to do 1,000, able to do 100, able to do 50s, able to be tens, and then heads of tribes. Every one of them contains this little spark of Moses. So now what's interesting is we can see why Moses is referenced in Hebrews when it talks about he was faithful in all of his house, right? That means all of the judges that were within his house, or those who that spirit had been distributed to, means that the gospel itself has an instruction within it to not only allow those or give space to those who can do what you do, but to trust that they have that within them as an instruction of the gospel, as a method. Because we have those who go and they make disciples, and they give the gospel, which is the good news that they are a royal priesthood, holy nation, peculiar people, special treasure of God, unique amongst the Gentiles, unique amongst the Jews, in that they have the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God, which is why the dragon is able to be involved in the first place. Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. Now we understand that part of the gospel is an instruction to make disciples. Where do we learn that from? Isaiah, that says, seal the Torah in your disciples. Furthermore, it says that the new covenant would be the Torah written upon the heart. So a sealing of Torah would be a calling of Torah from their heart out, a drawing of Torah out of the disciple, so that they would become a Shomer Torah and understand the power behind the covenant. But the intrigue is within the promise itself. Because as you know, when we look at Deuteronomy 28, we have 14 promises concerning if we shomer Torah, if you keep my commandments. That is not doing them, that's protecting them. So in that context, then what we understand is that what wasn't present when the stone that the builders rejected is mentioned, is Isaiah complaining about their violations of Torah, because it's not that they're not supposed to do or not do it, it's that they're supposed to protect it because of what they are. They are a priesthood. And furthermore, it says, why wouldn't you consult me? Why are you consulting mediums and spirits? You ask me. In other words, take the Torah to the nations and have them ask me of what would become of them. Stop accepting this information about some conspiracy that somebody is actually betraying Israel, because it is not that particular individual who's going and being a double spy that's the problem, but you choosing not to honor me as the one whom you consult. So in this parasha, we actually have the gospel. We have an instruction to make disciples. We have the instruction to trust that he's going to take a spark of you and put it in them, because I'm going to share something with you. If you don't view yourself in the magnitude of Moses, you are ineffective anyways. And don't think that's an easy task to accomplish. You need to start thinking that you are like Peter, that you are a friend of Yeshua, and that he's got your back. But then also we need to adjust our brains to realize there's one extra piece in this parasha, and that is the Ten Commandments. So what we are supposed to protect is contained in the Ten Commandments. What we are supposed to do to protect it is to assign people to protect it as we grow and begin to shine the light and awaken the light in others. This doesn't sound like a salvation issue, does it? It sounds more like let's show people how to live in such a way to activate the promises of God. Oh, but then it gets crazier, because then it says that not all Israel are Israel except those who are what? Sons of the promise. Now, I don't need to get into the element of faith within the context of promise, but what I want you to understand is this concept of gospel now stops being Christ and him crucified. That's a whole nother element where Israel had to be brought back in after she had been divorced, because the husband had to die. Now, in principle, now bringing Israel back in brings that new covenant to fruition of I will write my Torah upon their hearts. Ezekiel 36:26. Behold, I will remove the heart of stone and place a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you, and I will be your God, and you will shomer, guard my commandments. It's not about whether we break them or we don't. That's a mistake that Christianity thinks about. It's about whether we preserve it as our framework. And the key to this is that when we start pulling in all these other influences of polytheistic worship and an Easter bunny on Sunday morning and Easter egg hunts, and we have no connection to Yeshua within that construct, and the Passover was cut off by the anti-Semitic filth that was at Council of Nicaea, who did not have hearts for Yahweh, because they were not interested, in protecting his covenant, but also the principle behind it being the faithfulness within the fence of Torah. In other words, the fidelity. Remember, Israel, as the northern kingdom, was divorced from God as a result of a covenant violation of marriage through adultery. And adultery is very specifically one man having another man's covenant promise, which consequently we can identify then that whatever entity it was that Israel sold herself to had caused that adultery to occur. And she could not return to her husband. Let me illustrate for you. David had concubines. Those concubines were then gone into. Now, the only thing about concubine and its simplicity is a friend with benefits, so to speak. But the concept is that it's not a virgin, but they are not under the protection of marriage, which means they are not his covenant promise. Now, Absalom goes into him, and then after that, Absalom dies, and the priests come to David and say, could we put them to death? They committed adultery. He says, they didn't commit adultery. He says, no, let them live in the palace for the rest of their lives as widows of Absalom. Why? Because when a man goes into a woman after she's been divorced, she becomes now covenant promise to that man. And then coming back in, if she tried to reattach with her husband would be committing adultery. That's what Yeshua is saying in those verses. Fix your brain. Now, the next thing that's important about this is then we get into the context that if that's true, then the covenant which they broke has something to do with fidelity, has something to do with a faithfulness, not in the term of belief or creed or any of that other stuff, but instead within what? Obedience to the terms of the covenant. And the terms of the covenant were simple: to protect it, right? But then he goes in and he says, okay, you broke this one. It's not going to be the same as it was before. It's going to be a little bit different. Because why? Because there had to be a different husband. So he dies. Now she's released from the law of adultery. Then he resurrects. Now he's available to be joined to her again without adultery, because obviously she left the other husband, right? So she's sent away by him. Now she's available, but that coming back to him would have been considered adultery, so he had to die. Now he comes back. That has nothing to do with Christ and him crucified as a gospel, except to understand that what's being said by Peter is, you are this thing, versus Yahweh telling the people you will be this thing. What's the difference between the two? And this is the piece that you have to get. You have to believe that that's what you've become. Now, where this becomes absolutely imperative is that if you believe that's what you've become, you need to walk within the confines of the instruction in Yitro, which is obviously to guard those 10 commandments, which clearly are the covenant terms, but then also that you would make disciples, not trying to save people from hell. That is a construct to keep you behaving as a good peasant, but to instead elevate them in the light, to cause them to have a higher vibration of connection to their God, to the people around them, to their families, to reconnect their souls, to reconnect the divine energy that is given to this particular priesthood, that is given to this holy nation. Did you know that the word holy does not mean set apart, but means energized? Because the further you get away from the tabernacle, the less dangerous it was to be in contact with that energy if you were not in a correct state. If you were in a bad state and you approach the tabernacle, zing, you were done. And so we understand that that is energy, not set apartness. One of the most ridiculous things that I have ever found is this translation of kadosh as being set apartness. That is more Christian theology imposing itself upon Judaism, and Judaism buying into it, etc. Go back and read the church history. You'll find it. You'll find where there's a declaration that this is what it means, and therefore this is what it'll be. It is absolutely imperative that you understand that you have already been given this identity, but you have to walk in it, because he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. There is an imputation of it. So now you understand the gospel is not Christ and him crucified. It's great news that Yeshua rose from the dead, but it is not important to the information, because what's really important is that you go and tell a disciple, you are a priest. You are to take Torah to the nations. Oh, my bad. That means you got to stop eating bacon. Oh, and not only that, but you should probably not bring the Christmas tree into your house. You should seriously consider, at the very least, acknowledging that Yeshua was born at Sukkot, or Feast of Tabernacles, than at Christmas time, which consequently has something to do with Mithras, or Saturnella, or Bacchus, or Krampus, or I don't know, all those other polytheistic infiltrations of Christianity. And then there is a concept here that as you fall in, oh, here we go. As you fall into this alignment, you start to align with the cycles. And there's a new flow of abundance, of revelation, of happiness, of protections. locked into that information, and now you're going to pass it to another human. What a gift. Oh, the law is a curse. Well, you know what? I would say that might be a different gospel. And Paul said, if anybody comes preaching a different gospel, let them be accursed. We will continue this discussion in the Midrash. But if I leave you with something important, it is this. You do not have the right, authority, permission, or jurisdiction to determine whether someone is in a position of covenantal relationship with God or not. You furthermore do not have the ability to establish doctrine upon a simple response of an answer to a question that we don't have. You do not have the right to create doctrine that is contrary to your Torah that's been written upon your heart, which means there's a part of your heart that's hard if you can't answer that. If you're still stuck in the idea that Sunday is the Sabbath, go read the story of the Council of Trent and realize that your Sabbath that's already been written on your heart falls on a different day. You cannot do what you're doing. There is no one whom you are better than. There is no one whom you have elevated above in such a way that now you have to quote unquote save them. There is only one who saves, and that is Yahweh. And Yahweh, when he's in a state of salvation, is Yahshua, or Yeshua for short. Jesus Christ. That's it. He's the only one that can actually save, is Yahweh in that state. If you are caught up in the tree of knowledge of good and evil, deciding that you are good or evil and not worthy of the positions I just spoke of, royal priesthood, holy nation, peculiar people, then you have not crossed over yet, and therefore are not Hebrew, and therefore are not in a state of salvation, redemption, deliverance. And at the biggest one, imputation, where he took all of the rights and placed them on us, and took all of our mess and placed it on himself. So my instruction is simple. Stop using the word gospel, because that is not a very good word. Stop thinking that the gospel is the four narratives of Jesus Christ. Stop thinking that the gospel is Christ and him crucified, because it is not. And Paul did not preach it that way. Okay? Stop thinking that the gospel is the resurrection, because Paul was still trying to attain to it during his lifetime. Philippians chapter 3. Stop thinking that it is not important that Paul declared that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Right? Okay. So, like I said, we'll cover more of this in the Midrash, but what I really, really need you to grasp is that what you thought you understood about salvation, the gospel, all of those things is wrong. And the true gospel is contained in the Torah, and very specifically in this parasha. Shabbat Shalom.